Thank you so much for joining us after that wonderful plenary this morning. My name is Crystal Langholtz. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Oweesta Corporation. And we are looking forward to a wonderful and robust conversation on CRA. And I know that that's been a topic of conversation for many of us, as of course there's new guidance out and they're soliciting feedback right now. So what a timely opportunity for us to have the conversation we're going to have today. It's a really critical one for Native CDFIs, which is why there's been so much conversation in the media around it. In 2012, Oweesta did a research report, a snapshot of the Native CDFI movement. And at that time, we found that only 10% of Native CDFIs had received capital from banks. We, of course, revisit and do that research every year. Our Native CDFIs are so kind as to provide data and their stories to us. And even as of just last year, 10 years later, after the advances and all the wonderful impacts that have happened in our industry, only 17% had seen capital from banks. And so it's really critical, right? Some of the reasons for that lack of capital access has been a direct correlation with sort of current CRA policy. And so it's a really great time to reflect on that and think moving forward, and then also to talk about how to bridge and build connections with banks moving forward in the current CRA environment, but also moving forward as things continue to move and change in that space. So we are going to be joined today by four amazing presenters. We're going to be joined by Kathy Holmes with the OCC, who is going to talk about the history of CRA and its current treatment of Native CDFIs. We're also going to get the opportunity to look at the proposed changes in CRA with Michu Kokodoku with the Center for Indian Country Development. Then our great friend Steve Barbier from NeighborWorks America is going to talk about approaching banks and how that can be done and what are resources and tools that can help you build engagement. And last but not least, our friends from Flagstar Bank are going to talk about how their CRA program operates and shed some light around how CRA programs traditionally run and make that all just a little bit more understandable and how to approach and engage with new banking partners. So it's going to be a great conversation. We're going to have about 45 to 50 minutes of talking and engaging through that conversation. And then we're trying to leave about 10 to 15 minutes here for questions at the end. We would encourage you then, since we're going to have this time for Q&A at the end, to use your chat function that's in the platform, or to use the Q&A actual tab there as well. Either way, your comments or questions will get to us, and we will enjoy getting to hear from them at the close of the session today. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kathy Holmes with the OCC, and we're going to draw up a PowerPoint where we're going to get to learn a little bit about the history of the Community Reinvestment Act.
Thank you, Crystal. Hello, everyone. I'm Kathy Holmes, a Community Affairs Officer in the OCC's Western District, and I'm based in Denver. I'll be providing a brief overview of the CRA and some examples of certain community development activities that may receive CRA consideration. Next slide. CRA was enacted in 1977 to encourage financial institutions to meet the credit needs of their communities, consistent with safe and sound operations. It focuses on serving the credit needs of low and moderate income borrowers and geographies, small businesses, and small farms. CRA is a civil rights law that was part of the housing and lending reforms that came under the broader civil rights legislative umbrella during the 1960s and 1970s. It was a response to decades of discriminatory housing and lending policies and practices, including redlining and disinvestment in LMI communities. There have been a few amendments or revisions to CRA since 1977, two of which occurred in 1995 and 2005. Currently, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC have released a joint notice for proposed rulemaking, or NPR, to strengthen and modernize the CRA in order to expand financial access and inclusion to LMI communities. Since we are currently in the rulemaking process, I won't be discussing the NPR today. I will instead focus on the current treatment of bank activities under the CRA, sometimes referred to as the 1995 rule. As you may expect, once the agencies publish the revised regulation, it will take some time before it's fully effective. Next slide. There are three federal agencies that evaluate bank CRA performance: the OCC, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve Board. The OCC charters, regulates, and supervises all national banks and federal savings associations. Nationally chartered banks don't necessarily have a national footprint. There are some with just one branch and others that only have an online presence. So it varies. Also, some types of financial institutions like credit unions are not subject to CRA. There are other federal agencies that oversee aspects of banking operations, but they do not evaluate CRA performance. Next slide. Banks engage in a variety of lending, investment, and service activities in their communities to respond to the credit and community development needs. They provide these CRA activities to regulators to demonstrate their responsiveness. CRA requires regulators to evaluate each institution's record of meeting the credit needs of the communities in which they do business. The bank's CRA record is considered when they submit applications for activities like branching or merging. Next slide. Here are three of the 5 exam procedures under the current CRA rule. Small banks have assets less than 346 million and only have a lending test, meaning 100% of the exam is based on evaluating the bank's lending. Intermediate small banks have assets of at least 346 million and are subject to a lending and community development test. Large banks are those with assets of at least 1.3 billion. They are subject to a lending, investment, and service test. The asset thresholds for the exam procedures are adjusted annually and can be found on ffiec.gov. The other 2 exam procedures are for wholesale or limited purpose banks and banks with strategic plans. They each have a community development test. Next slide. The CRA encourages lending, investment, and services in communities that need them most. Under the CRA, bank loans, qualified investments, which include grants and in-kind donations, and services, have a primary purpose of community development if they support affordable housing for LMI individuals, community services targeted to LMI individuals, activities that promote economic development or for small businesses or small farms, and activities that revitalize or stabilize LMI census tracts, designated disaster areas, and distressed or underserved non-metropolitan middle-income geographies. Banks may receive CRA consideration for qualifying activities located in their designated assessment area or in a broader statewide or regional area that includes the assessment area. For those qualifying activities in a broader statewide or regional area that do not serve the bank's assessment area, they can also be considered if the bank has been responsive to community development needs and opportunities in its assessment area. Certain bank loans, services, and investments in CDFIs may be eligible for CRA consideration if the CDFI's activities promote community development and meet the CRA's geographic requirements. The next few slides include some general examples of community development activities that may qualify for CRA consideration. Next slide. Community development loans have a primary purpose of community development. Examples of community development loans in Indian country that banks may receive CRA consideration for include loans to a Native CDFI, a construction loan to a tribal housing authority, loans for tribal infrastructure projects such as water systems or broadband, or participating in federal loan guarantee programs designed to help meet the credit needs of LMI individuals, small businesses, or small farms in Indian country. For example, the HUD Section 184 and the HUD Title VI programs. Next slide. Qualified investments are lawful investments, deposits, membership shares, or grants that have a primary purpose of community development. An example of qualified investments includes investing in financial intermediaries such as Native CDFIs. Banks may also receive CRA consideration for investing in tribal new market tax credits and LIHTC projects. Next slide. Community development services have a primary purpose of community development and are related to the provision of financial services. For CRA consideration, banks can partner with Native CDFIs for financial education or collaborate with tribal organizations to provide technical assistance. Another example is a bank officer serving on the board of an organization that supports credit availability in Indian country. Next slide. That completes my review of the CRA, but I would like to briefly mention an important OCC initiative. 2 years ago, the OCC launched the Project REACH initiative. REACH stands for the Roundtable for Economic Access and Change. Project REACH brings together leaders from banking, business, technology, and national civil rights organizations to reduce specific barriers that prevent full, equal, and fair participation in the nation's economy. Project REACH work is divided into 4 work streams, including affordable homeownership, inclusion for credit invisibles, access to capital for small and minority-owned businesses, and revitalization of minority depository institutions. The work streams also have subcommittees. For example, I participate on the Native American Homeownership Subcommittee, which is a subgroup of the affordable homeownership work stream. You'll hear more about Project REACH later. Thank you. I'll now turn it back over to Crystal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathy. That was such a great overview. And next, we're happy to welcome up Michu to talk about the current NPR, and we're happy to get the updates from him on that revision process.
Thank you, Crystal. And again, my name is Michu Kokoroko, and I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and also with the Center for Indian Country Development. So I'm happy to be here today, but I'd like to start off with my fair disclaimer that the views that I expressed yesterday are my own view. It do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or of the Federal Reserve System. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. And again, Kathy sort of gave us the introduction to CRA, and then also briefly mentioned that the 3 agencies are working really right now to sort of solicit input from the public, input into the new NPR that is out there. And again, I just want to briefly highlight the fact that during the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, we heard so many things about Native communities and why the reform is required. For instance, the agencies recognize that banking and credit access remains a chronic barrier on Native lands and in tribal communities. And many Native communities actually fall outside of current bank CRA assessment areas, meaning little or no incentive to invest. And then also the relationship gaps hamper the growth of Native businesses and tribal economies. And also many banks claim not to have specialized expertise to conduct financial activities on tribal lands. And of course, we all appreciate the work of CDFIs and MDIs, and they are key, but need more capacity. So the agencies have considered all of that in order to put out there the NPR that we have right now. So in my presentation, I like to focus on key areas in the proposal that actually affect the work that you all do in Native communities. Next slide, please. I won't go through the objectives here because of time, but I'd like to kind of highlight the 6 objective in the NPR that says that it was to promote transparency and public engagement. And actually, the proposal does recognize the transparency and public engagement. They know that is very fundamental. So therefore, if you had a chance to take a look at the NPR, you'll see that one transparency-focused proposal was to include Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA as we call it, include that information that already exists in large bank performance evaluation. So specifically, this will cover mortgage originations and applications that are broken down by borrower race and ethnicity. And this disclosure will be for transparency purposes only and will not factor into an agency CRA evaluation for a bank. And then the seventh one, to ensure that CRA and fair lending are mutually reinforcing. Next slide, please. And the first key area that you see in the proposal has to do with the definition of native lands. Now, as we learned from Kathy, CRA does encourage banks to conduct certain community development activities within designated geographies. However, the current regulations do not include a specific definition for certain community development activities in native land areas. So in the NPR, the agency proposed to define native land areas to include the geographies that you see on the slide. So we have all of these included in what we call NLAs. Now, this geographic definition is broader than the statutory definition of Indian country. And then you see that the agencies wanted to make sure that all of the areas are included and are inviting comment on the definition that is out there. Next slide, please. Now, to help address the challenges specific to NLAs, the agencies proposed creating a definition for qualifying community development activities that are targeted to and conducted in these geographic areas to include revitalization activities in NLAs, essential community facilities in NLAs, essential community infrastructure in NLAs, and a disaster preparedness and climate resiliency activities in NLAs. I want to note that in addition to these place-based community development activities, other community development activities such as affordable housing or economic development could also qualify for consideration in NLAs, provided that they otherwise meet the eligibility standards for those particular activities. Now, I'll go in and highlight a couple of points regarding these place-based activities. Next slide, please. Now, regarding revitalization activities in NLAs, the condition says these activities have to be undertaken in conjunction with a federal, state, local, or tribal government plan or program or initiative with explicit focus on revitalizing or stabilizing NLAs, and a particular focus on low and moderate income households. So these are the key things we want to remember. Again, benefit of self-resident, including low and moderate income resident, and then also making sure that they do not displace or exclude low and moderate income resident in a targeted census tract. Next slide, please. And for the essential community facilities and infrastructures, I have here a definition of what those could be. For facilities, we're talking about financing or other support for public facilities that provide essential services generally accessible by local community, including but not limited to schools, libraries, childcare facilities, parks, hospital, healthcare facilities, and community centers. And then for the infrastructure, we're talking about financing or other support for infrastructure, including but not limited to broadband, telecommunication, mass transit, water supply and distribution, and sewage treatment and collection system. And again, to be considered a qualifying activity, these essential community facilities and essential community infrastructure must also benefit or serve residents, including low or moderate income residents in native land areas. And they also do not need to displace or exclude any low or moderate income resident. And then finally, they have to work in conjunction with federal, state, local, or tribal government plan, program, or initiative that benefit or serves residents of native land areas and not displace or exclude low and moderate income residents of such geographic areas. Next slide, please. And then the last one, last place-based activity, disaster preparedness and climate resiliency. Well, that includes activities that assist individuals and communities to prepare for, adapt to, and withstand natural disasters, weather-related disasters or climate-related risk. Next slide, please. Now, this is kind of a new thing also in a proposal. Under the current regulations and guidance, bank examiners, talking about examiners for the 3 banking agencies, consider both quantitative and qualitative aspects of a bank community development activity to determine whether these activities are innovative, complex, or responsive to identify community needs. However, without clear standards to measure innovativeness, complexity, or responsiveness, the evaluation relies heavily on examiner judgment. So as a remedy, the agencies propose a list of impact review factors for the qualitative evaluation of community development activities. So in the list, we have activities that support MDI, WDI, LSCU, or Treasury Certified CDFI, and also activities that benefit Native communities, such as qualifying activities in NLAs. They all receive qualitative consideration as impactful and responsive. Next slide, please. And then in the proposal, they define CDFIs as Treasury Department certified, and all activities with this organization will be eligible, CRA activities. And then the CDFIs that are not certified by Treasury Department, the activities conducted with them could also qualify for CR consideration if the activities separately met the defined eligibility criteria of a different prong of community development definition. Now, there are a number of questions in the NPR, a total of 180 questions that the agencies are seeking feedback on. I've listed here 4 of them that are specific to native land areas regarding the definition of the areas, eligibility requirement, and the location of the beneficiaries, whether inside or outside of native land areas. And then lastly, one other thing that I like to highlight is the treatment of bank branches. And again, the idea here is to have a provision that can address what some people call banking desert. So there is a provision to obtain a positive quality consideration under the retail services and product test for bank branches in native land areas and in other places with low levels of branch access. And then this, I believe, the session host will put those links in the chat for you all. This is a public meeting, but we're not going to be collecting opinions on the NPR. We rather want to encourage all of you to submit your comment using the link that we have here on this slide. And now I would like to turn the meeting back over to Crystal. Thank you.
Thank you, Michu. That's a lot of questions, but I love that we're being called to give feedback in that space, and with only 17% of our partners having accessed bank capital, it seems like a really great opportunity. So appreciate you walking us through that. It was really nicely laid out, right? So I appreciate that. So we're gonna call Steve Barbier up to the stage. And I have an anecdotal story to share about when I first became a Native CDFI executive director on the Crow Creek Reservation. And I kid you not, I went to a bank branch and I stood in front of the teller and I said, hey, you're supposed to like support communities, right, through your Community Reinvestment Act. How can you, like, how does that work? Can you give us money? I was not afraid to ask anybody for money even then. Yeah, because it was so mystifying how CRA worked and how you built partnerships with banks. And so part of this, right, is making sure that the rules and the policies fit really well. And serve Native communities. But part of it also too is learning how to navigate those systems and how to research banks and how to build partnerships. So we are so grateful for Steve. When I first saw his presentation, I was like, oh, this is what I've been missing my whole life. This is how you build banking partnerships. So with that, I'm going to have Steve turn on his camera and welcome him to sort of talk about that.
Thank you very much, Crystal. It's great to be here with this great panel. So really appreciate it. And as Kathy mentioned, next slide, Steph, please. As Kathy mentioned, Project REACH of the OCC, and she mentioned the Native Homeownership Financing Subcommittee. I have the pleasure of participating on that subcommittee. And as you can see from this list on the left side of the table, we have really some of the large financial institutions, in the country on this particular panel. So it's a great discussion. And we've been working through this process of education with these financial institutions, as well as a larger group of institutions back in January with a webinar on Indian Country Lending 101 and decoding trust land transactions. And so this education piece, I think, is really an important process. Just last week, I think we did a Section 184 session with this group. But we've been working on several projects as well. One project is the potential for investing in Native housing loan fund, developing a white paper with recommendations on getting more government-backed and private capital into Indian country for home ownership, and a potential partnership work group with a listening session and strategies for matching financial institutions with Native organizations. And next slide, please, Steph. So this challenge, I think, of how to connect financial institutions with Native organizations is a great question. Banking is a relationship-based business. Who do you know in the market today? You can never know enough people. This particular Oweesta Capital Access convening and the annual sessions that have been had in the past, it was a great way to meet people, a great way to be introduced to who's interested. Various in-person housing and economic development conferences, important avenue. The Federal Reserve Investment Connection, the Federal Reserve hosts this series around the country in different markets and feature nonprofit organizations pitching, their CRA projects to financial institutions. Certainly asking or researching other nonprofit organizations and who they've worked with. And then your own research. So in regard to your own research, next slide, please. It's not easy. It's not a simple way to conduct research on financial institutions, but one resource is the FFIEC website, which posts information on CRA ratings, underserved tracts, HMDA data, which was mentioned, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, as well. With HMDA data, you can research, loan denials in your market. Next slide, please. So in doing a research on CRA ratings, for example, in your location, in your community, and this particular example is Walla Walla, Washington. You'll see the financial institution ratings and exams over the last 30 years. And of course, you're more interested in those more recent examinations and what the rating was, what the asset size was, and whether it's a large bank, small bank, et cetera. And however, this particular research only pulls up organizations with a main office in the particular community you're searching on. So it's a start, it's a hint, as to, where to look and the next step in gathering information. Next slide, please. All financial institutions are required to have a CRA public file, as Crystal mentioned when she went up to that counter at the bank. You're asking for information on the financial institution because you're conducting your research. Most of these files are hard copy right now, and you do have to go up to the branch, to ask for a copy of the file. You may even have to pay for that file. But I'm seeing more financial institutions starting to post their CRA public file on the web, which makes it much easier. Particularly those organizations that have outstanding ratings, just my observation. Next slide, please. So it's good, to continue research and obtain that copy of the performance evaluation from a recent period to learn more about that financial institution. You'll see it often broken down by their assessment areas, their various markets that they work in, and how they did in those particular markets. And then you'll also see some examples, only, usually 2 or 3, of a particular investment or a community development activity that may have risen to the top as an example in that particular market, but that's good information. Next slide, please. And I think it was Kathy or Mishu mentioned that certain financial institutions also develop and issue a strategic plan. And the strategic plan can even have more information in it in terms of the organization's focus, their goals, their evaluation of the market needs of the community, and even whether or not, and it was also mentioned that there's this thing called broader statewide or regional area for financial institutions that would like to operate outside their traditional target market, assuming they've met the needs already of that target market. And if I was a Native CDFI in a state surrounding Utah, I'd be particularly interested in getting to know the large financial institutions in Utah, as that happens to be a location, given their banking laws, that may just have more available capital for CRA investment than they do demand. Next slide, please. There is also a way to look up the financial institutions by state on the OCC's website, which is helpful to see who's in your region, who's in your state, and that's a good place to gather information as well. Next slide, please. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition on their website provides more clues in terms of branch locations in a community. And this is, you can see the various bubbles on this particular graphic that are sized by market share, by deposits in a particular geography. And that can give you some clues about, just what the market presence is of a financial institution in that market. And some CRA officers try to at least match CRA eligible investment with deposits in a particular branch. I'd like to do a quick plug for the Center for Indian Country Development as such a great partner when you're developing your own sort of case, for your presentation. The reservation profiles on the CICD website, has some great reservation specific information, and I'm told they will be updating that with 2020 census information. Next slide, please. I think Native CDFIs will have an advantage today, but will have such an advantage in the future. You know, and in addition to sort of the other arguments around local intermediary access to, you know, to customers, there, you know, there's also potential for investments and loans may result in CRA credit in subsequent years following the original investment, if the investment is still on the books of the financial institution. Next slide, please. So building the relationship, Native CDFIs have more work to do, I think, than other CDFIs, in that you, and often you're remote locations, you're needing to educate your partners on trust land. You know, fear of the unknown is there, it's real, and you know, need to provide that education to decode trust land transactions and help to demystify, you know, that work. Next slide, please. So what do funders look for in a project? You know, there's some great information on the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in terms of their investment connection, but they often look for a return to the bank. They look for, will a CRA project have an extended period of time for CRA credit? They're looking for a comprehensive story of the organization responding to community needs to be more attractive to the financial institution. Next slide, please. And in terms of what they're looking for in an organization, they're looking for alignment with the stated mission. They're looking for financial and operational stability. They're looking to the ability to communicate impact and strategies for mitigating risk. So next slide, please. Policy maps can be a great tool, I think, for helping an organization analyzing and communicating information about your community and your organization. As Lael Brainerd, Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of the Federal Reserve Bank system, said in a recent interagency session on the NPR, this is about getting to the last mile. And you, Native CDFIs, Indian country, Native lands, as well as much of the rest of rural America, is that last mile. So this is an important opportunity, I think, to move forward and to move that 17% figure up. I've also included, next slide, please. Also included some links which are available in the presentation or maybe in the chat on using that FFIEC website in particular and decoding that a bit. And looking up HMDA as well as other information on the website. So with that, Crystal, I will turn it back to you, and thank you.
That's so wonderful, Steve. That, like I said, that I wish I had gotten that talk like 10 years ago. So really wonderful. And I think you're so right, sort of in the, you know, and not only do banks want relationships, but, you know, our partners want real relationships too. Our Native CDFIs are inherently partnership-based organizations and looking for deep connections. So it was so great to think about some tools for that. And speaking of partners, we're excited to welcome up Brandon Lewis, who's the Senior CRA Compliance Specialist for Flagstar Bank, which is a bank that is interested in building partnerships with Native communities and is become a new partner for Oweesta. And so we are just really excited to have them talk a little bit around their CRA programs and demystifying that and just talk about it specifically from a banking perspective. So with that, I will let Brandon flip on his camera and turn it over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you all here today. Just wanted to talk about, you know, our institution generally, wanted to talk about, you know, continuation on making connections from the bank perspective, and then go through an example of a development that we're involved with Native American tribe and partners. If you can go to the next slide real quick. Okay, this is just an overview of Flagstar. We're a national mortgage lender and a 5-state community bank. We are filled with very passionate community development professionals, myself included. We are just coming off of an outstanding rating for our CRA exam. We credit that to being very, we take a position of advocacy with what we're doing in our communities. We tell our regulators, we've done these certain activities for these particular reasons, which always have to do with benefiting the communities that we serve as best as possible. Now, I do say communities we serve, as we saw with the OCC summary, the Federal Reserve summary. From a CRA perspective, we do have to ensure that our local communities, determined by where we take deposits, needs are met. So we do have to focus there by regulation. That is an area where during this NPR process, the Native American community could certainly advocate for, tribal land specific, I'll say exclusions from the general rule that banks need to invest where they're located. That's just a bit of a sidebar. But our bank, the retail bank is a full service retail bank. We've got all the retail products. We do mortgage lending, consumer lending, small business lending. I forgot to put in the slide, but we do small business as well, which can tie into, SBIC, small business investment corporations, if any of those are serving Native communities. We are very passionate about affordable housing. We do debt and equity on affordable housing deals, whether LIHTC or not. And then we do philanthropy. And some of the Native American partners that we work with are beneficiaries of our philanthropy as well. Next slide, please. Now, this is building on what Steve was saying. Quick disclaimer, we have some fantastic web developers at Flagstar who can put together great presentations. I'm not one of them. So the screenshot you're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide is just cobbled together by me. My apologies there. But what that is a little snippet of the bottom of our website, flagstar.com. You can actually go to About Flagstar, expand that drop down, and you can see community involvement right there. So we're talking about how to get in the door here. This example on the right-hand side is what I would call a direct access portal to community banks or any bank. Do this by hitting bank websites. Go to a bank website, find banks in your area. Actually, apologize for being all over the place here, but I want to add one resource to the resources that Steve mentioned, and that is the FDIC summary of deposits information that is available on FDIC's website. You can actually put your county into that search or your state, and you can see a summary of all the institutions that have branches in the location that you are in. And you can see by branch how much deposits each institution holds. So I would add that as a reference. But once you find out who's there, start hitting the websites of these banks. So you can see on the slide here, if you want to go into the community reinvestment area of the bank, a lot of banks will have links on their website that say community or CRA or community involvement. Click on those links, see where they take you. In Flagstar's case, if you click on that community involvement link, you are going to get the whole CRA team in front of you. You're going to see my picture, the CRA director's picture, and email addresses. You can reach out to us directly. There's a lot of banks that have those services or those links on their website. If you can't get in through CRA, you can try going in through like a philanthropy type link. Look for things like corporate responsibility or giving back. Click on those links, see where they take you. They very well may take you to the person you need to talk to, and follow that link and talk to those people. If the website does not provide what you need, feel free to call a bank's general customer service line and keep calling until you get someone who actually gives you the name of a person that you need to talk to. I've had luck. I've done research on other banks, and I've actually called into other banks through their customer service lines in the past. But I'm I'm bold in that way, and I encourage you guys to do the same kinds of things. And the other thing is collect contact information from the bank's CRA public notice in their branches. That public notice is required to give you information for who to submit comments regarding CRA compliance to. That's usually a CRA director or a compliance director. You don't need to use that necessarily to complain. You can use that to say, hey, this is my organization, this is what we do, we are located where you are located, this is our mission, let's have a conversation. You're gonna find with most banks serving your area that they're wanting to have these conversations with you. If you get into a bank, you're talking to their community development person and you get a cold shoulder, try again. Maybe try a different community development professional at that bank. We're generally speaking in community development, we're on the same team. We want our communities to be bolstered by business activity. And we're wanting, good business dictates meeting the needs of all the communities. There's no sense in leaving anyone behind. So be bold. This is a little bit of a pep talk. And I think you'll be very surprised pleasantly that once you start the conversation, there's a lot of people in banks who are wanting to have those discussions. Can we do next slide, please? I want to wrap up just by showing an example of, a recent project that we're involved with the Flagstar. This is up in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. This is literally across the river from Canada. So this is up there. This is a low-income housing tax credit project. The pictures are where it is now, obviously, not finished, but this building is going to be rehabbed into 10 affordable units, and there's going to be an additional 26 affordable units built on this site. This is using low-income housing tax credits, and our partners here are Community Housing Network, which is a developer we work with extensively, the Chippewa County Community Foundation, and the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. So these partners and us are going to be turning this project into high-quality affordable housing. It's guaranteed to remain affordable for 45 years. And this is a great location. There's to the extent you can call it a business district, Sault Ste. Marie is not a huge metropolis, but it's close to a downtown business district. It's in an opportunity zone. Anytime that federally designated opportunity zones overlie or border native lands, you can also go in from that angle and tell banks that this is another opportunity for you. But these kind of projects, banks like Flagstar, we want to hear of all the opportunities that we can do a project like this. Now, disclaimer, the same disclaimer that I gave earlier does apply at this point, and that is we do need to, in order to get credit from the OCC, we do need to have these generally in our areas or close to. So anything in the Midwest, I'm willing to go to the OCC and say, you should give us credit for this because it's in the Midwest region. But ideally, you're going to want a bank partner under the current regulatory scheme. You're going to want a bank partner that's relatively close to you so that they can get credit. But yeah, I would love to be involved in a future session of this where this project is finished and we can show you some after photos, because this truly will go from a derelict building that I think is a leftover from the 1940s or so to some high quality affordable housing. And this is the kind of stuff that we love doing with our community partners. You'll find that banks are eager to do these things. We want to have these discussions. There are cases where opportunities exist that we don't know about because no one's told us about. So just get that dialogue going. I appreciate the other presenters laying the foundation for this discussion. But reach out, be bold, and if you get the wrong person or the right person on the wrong day, try a different day. So that concludes my pep talk. Thanks for giving me the time here, and I'll turn it back to you, Crystal.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, and what a great way to sort of end the conversation as showing an example of a successful project in the works, what can happen with those partnerships. So this last slide has some great interagency resources that are available. I would also note that we shared a lot of resources throughout the course of the conversation. Many of those would be in the chat. So if you have not looked in the chat of your of the venue itself, please go ahead and look at it now, because you'll see where we have on the fly, we even looked up some of them that were just verbally communicated. So in Attendee Hub, yes. So appreciate that. With that, we do have the perfect amount of time left if everybody wants to turn on their cameras, and we'll take down the presentation. We'll go ahead and we will open it up for questions. We did have a couple that came through, and we'll go ahead and pose those. And then, of course, if we have other ones that are still coming in, that would be great. We'll also look at those. And we might even have some questions for each other. So one of the questions that came through was they were curious how the OCC and FDIC work together to support cash flowing into Native communities for loans and deposits. Keeping money circulating in Native communities is critical, and investors having depository and lending relationships is critical. So does anyone want to jump in and address that?
Address.
Thanks, Kathy.
Sure. Well, one way the OCC and the FDIC and even the Fed can, address this issue is that we often collaborate for interagency outreach and training that address various aspects of lending and investment in Indian country. We train and educate bankers and community development organizations. We facilitate partnerships between banks, tribal, state, and local entities. And, we talk about community development, small business finance, and financial inclusion programs at a lot of those events.
Awesome. Thank you.
I have just one question, somewhat adding on to that. From some of our Native CDFIs, and it's, a very small handful, unfortunately, and we're hoping to really maximize the potential for CRA investments in our Native institutions. What we've heard on the participant level is it's very important that you have a really good relationship with your regulator, and that the regulator understands that this particular bank may want to go outside of a service area. I understand we're really trying to expand that within the revisions within CRA, but can you give us any advice or what you've possibly seen in those measures of speaking with a regulator for these institutions or investors that are interested in working with Native communities? We've heard some aspects of, that's outside your target market, and they've really had to educate their regulators to say, well, there's a provision in CRA where this is, available. So what we somewhat hear on the grassroots level is those relationships with your partner, but your partner more so with the regulator, to have everything encompassed within the data sets and provision of services is incredibly important. So have you just in that regard, seen or heard or have any recommendations on working with regulators in this measure?
Well, I definitely recommend banks and even community development organizations, CDFIs, to reach out to local community affairs representatives, or if it's a bank, reach out to their supervisory office and get clarification on some of those questions. We're more than happy to assist or research and work with anyone.
I can add maybe one comment. The Federal Reserve Bank is very much interested in how to support the capacity of Native CDFIs. So we are actually in a process of analyzing how Native CDFIs are structured and what aspects of that structure really does have an impact on individual credit outcomes. And of course, we're doing that in partnership with Oweesta. The goal is to sort of present a picture that the average investor can easily consume. And then that picture that can kind of portray the work of Native CDFIs, how they fill in the gaps, and then also, of course, present some of the challenges that they face on a daily basis, thereby inviting some of the banks to sort of not only improve the CRA image, but also provide capital and credit to these organizations.
Awesome. We had another question come through. Curious, does Flagstar offer grants alongside loans that it makes to Native CDFIs? So that would be for you, Brandon.
Yeah. I know we do grants. We do them through our foundations. We support CDFIs. We would definitely be interested in having conversations, especially anything that's located in that Midwest region I was talking about. We are, I'm kind of hinted at the state of flux we're in right now as far as the regulatory regime changing. We always walk a fine line of, if we're investing outside of our service area, are we going to hear from the OCC, well, why did you do this outside of your service area, and which service area did you neglect in order to do that? So we do have that fine line that we walk. The answer to grants is yes. The answer to do we support CDFIs is yes. Anywhere possible when we can do that through a business relationship, such as this LIHTC deal that I use as an example. We're involved in the debt and equity there. So we are, what I will say about Flagstar is we are open to having any conversation. And yes, there are grant funds through our foundation and through our CRA business line.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brandon. Another question that came in is, I work at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, and we are eager to help connect Native American tribal organizations in New England with lenders. What suggestions, regional entities do you suggest working with? Anyone have any thoughts on that one?
Is that just open to the group? A lot of the stuff, so that was from a Federal Home Loan Bank?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I would look at Federal Home Loan Bank members in your area, and then also look at maps of tribal lands and see where the tribal lands that might be in your service area are, and just start cold calling.
Awesome. I love that. We have another couple questions that have come through here. So Steve, this one looks like it's for you. You mentioned a couple of Native American institutions, such as the Center for Native American Investment. Could you clarify websites or names?
Thank you, Crystal, and thanks from our colleague in Boston. I mentioned the Center for Indian Country Development. I think it's a great resource for Indian country, and I highlighted the reservation profiles, which is pretty in-depth information on reservations. I think that is a good one. Let's see, well, I think, just as I mentioned also, policy maps is a great way for organizations to analyze as well as communicate, markets in their particular area, because you can layer production on top of low moderate income census tracts, on top of areas of persistent poverty. So I think those are some good ones. And, Center for Indian Country Development, I only highlighted the reservation profiles, but they really have a much broader set of information regarding small business lending. And Mish, you could talk about that, I'm sure, at length. So.
Awesome. Well, I know there were another couple questions that had started to come in. I love it. We got to the question and answers, and we were engaged and had some good ones come in there. But we did hit time. So you do have everyone's contact information, and so we will make sure that you have that available to you. These slides will be downloadable and available to you. These are very approachable people, and so if you have further questions for them, I am absolutely confident that you can reach out to them directly, and if not, you can always reach out to us at Oweesta here as we continue this conversation. We are going to head out. We'll give you a short break here before we go to our breakout sessions this afternoon. Those start at 1:30 Mountain Time. So you do have a half an hour break to get your cup of coffee and have some lunch, hopefully. And then we will join. You can go to your independent breakout rooms. I just want to circle back one more time and thank our amazing panelists. It was so good. It was so concise, and you communicated everything just so clearly and cleanly. We got some very nice comments in the chat too from about the wonderful quality of your presentation. So thank you all so much, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day.